Welcome, listener. This is Sebastian Nothwell, here to introduce the 5th chapter of my gay Victorian romance, Mr. Warren's Profession, narrated by Gary Furlong. Enjoy!
Chapter 5. To Lindsey, the trip from Manchester to London felt as if the train were floating rather than rumbling over the steel track. He smiled to himself in the hansom cab between the station and the townhouse, the sound of his name on Aubrey's lips ringing in his mind. His cheerful mood continued all afternoon and evening, on through the night, and remained with him the following dawn. He greeted his valet, Charles, with unwarranted enthusiasm when the latter brought his morning tea and biscuit, and grinned at all the staff he passed in the townhouse's halls. He laughed louder than ever at Clarence's jokes in the club, laughed off Graves's criticism of his favourite novels over dinner, and laughed at Rowena's disapproval of his laughter throughout the day. For the rest of the week, nothing could persuade him that the world was anything but bright and beautiful and inherently good. It all ground to a halt the following Monday when he entered the London House's library to find his father at the shelves. Sir Geoffrey glanced up sharply at his son's entrance. Lindsey froze in place on the threshold. "Good morning, sir," he said. Sir Geoffrey turned back to his books. He had one in hand already, and was running his fingers over the spines of its shelved companions, searching for its proper place. "Good news from the mill?" "Indeed," Lindsey replied too quickly, over-eager for any assistance in crafting the lie he needed. "The, profits are quite satisfactory." "And unnecessary," added Sir Geoffrey. "Still, I'm happy for you." He neither looked nor sounded particularly happy, but Lindsey chose to take him at his word. His blood still sang with elation from his encounter at the mill. A little thing like his father's perpetual disappointment couldn't sour his mood. He wished he could pass on some of his cheer to Sir Geoffrey. There'd never been much Lindsey could do to please his father, but he knew of one possible method. "Would you care for a game of chess, sir?" Sir Geoffrey's moustache twitched, and the corners of his eyes crinkled. He set his book aside. "Yes, I believe I would." Lindsey hurried to fetch the board. Sir Geoffrey approached the table at a more sedate pace, as Lindsey set the pieces up. Black went on his father's side, and white on his own, a tradition begun when Lindsey was a child, just learning to play. Though Sir Geoffrey gave his son the advantage of the first move, his tactics were otherwise merciless. He never once held back to allow Lindsey to win. If his son desired success, he would have to earn it. And he had earned it, eventually. Over years of play, they'd become more evenly matched, until Lindsey's chances of winning were as good as a coin toss. In recent times, he'd started to win a little more often than that, just by a hair, the smallest increase. As a child, he'd assumed such victories would bring him joy. As a man, they unnerved him. He wasn't used to having any advantage over his father, no matter how inconsequential. This new balance of power didn't rest easy on his shoulders. But perhaps Sir Geoffrey would win today. Lindsey held on to that comforting thought as he made his opening move. The game progressed slowly, with equal ground gained and lost on either side. Belle wandered in as Lindsey's queen took one of Sir Geoffrey's rooks. As Sir Geoffrey's favourite hound, Belle had the honour of accompanying him from country to town. She settled under the table between Lindsey and his father. Sir Geoffrey scratched behind her ears, then demolished Lindsey's bishop. Halfway through the match, when Lindsey thought he might have regained the upper hand, Charles appeared in the doorway. Sir Geoffrey sat with his back to the door and didn't perceive the valet's approach. Lindsey, however, took immediate notice. While the chessboard arrested his father's attention, Lindsey dared to cast an inquiring glance at his valet, but Charles remained tight-lipped. Whatever his business, it was important enough for him to come find Lindsey, but not urgent enough to interrupt the match. Distracted by curiosity, Lindsey suffered a sudden, crushing defeat. Sir Geoffrey sat back with a suspicious frown. Lindsey braced for his father to accuse him of throwing the match. "You're too protective of your queen," said Sir Geoffrey. Lindsey balked. "Sir?" Sir Geoffrey shook his head, his stern gaze focused on the board. "I've told you time and time again, boy. You sacrifice everything to keep her in play when a calculated loss would give you an advantage, if not the outright win." Lindsey relaxed. "Yes, sir." Sir Geoffrey, apparently satisfied, moved to rise. Charles stepped backward into the hallway before entering the room, preserving the illusion of just now coming in. He passed Sir Geoffrey as the latter returned to the bookcase. Sir Geoffrey paid him enough attention to prevent a collision, but no more. "What is it, Charles?" said Lindsey. Charles flicked his eyes over to Sir Geoffrey, who continued ignoring them both, then returned to Lindsey and leaned in to answer in a low tone. "You've a visitor, sir." Lindsey's hopes soared with the thought of Aubrey Warren, here on his very doorstep. "A Miss Brewster," Charles continued. If he noticed how these words crushed Lindsey's spirit, he gave no sign of it. "She claimed you were expecting her. She was most insistent. I had Timothy put her in the front parlour." "Timothy? The new footman, sir." "Ah." Lindsey stood up. "I suppose I'd better see to it, then." "Very good, sir." Lindsey bid his father good day as he left the library. Sir Geoffrey spared him a nod, then returned to the shelves. When Lindsey reached the front parlour, he found Miss Brewster standing in the centre of the room, a small carpet bag in hand, her attention flitting between the lace-curtained windows and the tall mahogany mirror over the marble-topped mantel. "Miss Brewster," said Lindsey. He left the door open for propriety's sake, wondering if he oughtn't call his sister in as well. It couldn't do Miss Brewster's reputation any good to be alone in a room with a bachelor, but she didn't seem to think anything of it. "Mr. Althorp," she replied. She continued examining the oriental carpet under their feet, then met his eyes with a face stern enough to halt an oncoming train. Lindsey likewise paused before responding. "Would you care to sit down?" It felt like offering a seat to a lioness. Miss Brewster glanced over the pink velvet chairs sprinkled throughout the room. She didn't wrinkle her nose exactly, but came very near to it. Yet she thanked him all the same and perched on the edge of a cushion, setting her carpet bag by her boots. Lindsey sat next to her. He didn't like looming over her. Far from giving him the high ground, it seemed to expose his fleshy underbelly to her predatory stare. He cleared his throat. "Is there something I may do for you, Miss Brewster?" "Many things, I'm sure." A smile flashed across her lips, a glint of bared teeth, then her stony expression returned. "But first I must thank you for keeping your word. You find your new wages satisfactory?" "It's a start," she conceded. "In return, I brought what I promised." She opened her carpet bag. Lindsey watched in fascination as she rummaged through its contents. At last, she produced a pamphlet and held it out to him. He took it dumbly, his lips pursed in confusion. They smoothed out into a grin as he beheld the words "Rook Mill Women Workers Union" printed on the top page. "Thank you, Miss Brewster," he said, flicking it open to peruse its contents. A resulting silence induced him to raise his head and see her regarding him with one eyebrow elevated far above the other. "You're welcome," she said, still giving him an odd look. "Is something wrong?" "No," she said, drawing out the word. "It's just—" "May I be frank, Mr. Althorp?" "Of course." "Most gentlemen don't give two bits what their workforce wants, much less ask for their literature. But I adore literature." Miss Brewster looked yet more disturbed. Lindsey hastened to elaborate. "That is to say, I'm most intrigued by your ideas. I'm rather new to this whole manufacturing business, you see. I'd like to do it right. And it can't be right if my workforce is unhappy. Indeed, I don't see how the mill could function in such a state. Surely the happiest workforce is the most productive. I certainly accomplish more when I'm happy with what I'm doing and feel it's worthwhile." Miss Brewster continued to stare at him. "I suppose so," she said at last, though her concerned look never wavered. Before Lindsey could add anything more, she rose. "Thank you for hearing our concerns, Mr. Althorp. I'll not trouble you any further today." Lindsey stood as well and pulled the bell rope. A footman arrived to show Miss Brewster out. She eyed him warily before accepting his escort. "If you've any questions," she said as she departed, "you know where to find me." Once she'd gone, Lindsey picked up the pamphlet and wandered back down the hall to his own rooms, reading as he walked. The pamphlet employed a fiery breed of rhetoric. Lindsey couldn't help admiring its passionate language, though the charges laid out against the mill's previous owner felt somewhat harsh. "Who was that?" Lindsey stumbled to a halt. In the hall before him stood Sir Geoffrey. "Sir," said Lindsey, dropping the hand holding the pamphlet to his side, and giving his father his full attention. "That woman with the carpet-bag, who was she? A new maid?" "Yes," said Lindsey. Something in his chest twisted as he did so, as if he'd actually bruised his conscience by presenting Miss Brewster as anything other than her true self. Certainly the lady herself wouldn't approve. Rowena meant to interview her, but it seems there was some confusion as to the time and place. Sir Geoffrey gave him a long, inquisitive look. Lindsey stood firm under it. Experience had taught him it wouldn't do any good to flinch from scrutiny. "You've sent her packing, then?" Sir Geoffrey said at last. Lindsey swallowed. "Yes, sir." "Good. She'd never last here if she can't keep track of the time." With that, Sir Geoffrey passed by and was gone. Lindsey withheld his sigh of relief and hurried to the safety of his own chambers, Miss Brewster's pamphlet clutched in his fist. The telegram arrived on Lindsey's doorstep not a moment too soon. He leapt into the family carriage and took off for the mill. The journey seemed shorter than ever before. Within the space of a blink, he'd arrived. The office held Aubrey alone, bent over his work. Lindsey didn't question his good fortune. He made a beeline for the desk. As he approached, Aubrey looked up and stood to greet him with a warm smile. "Lindsey," he said. Lindsey reached across the desk to stroke the clerk's porcelain cheek. Aubrey leaned in to the touch, turning to press a kiss to Lindsey's palm. Lindsey rushed forward. The desk had disappeared. He didn't know where it went. He didn't care, and claimed Aubrey's lips in his own. Aubrey's thigh slipped between Lindsey's legs to brush against his stirring prick. Both their clothes had gone the way of the desk, leaving Lindsey's hands free to roam over the supple landscape of Aubrey's bare flesh. Their bodies pressed together, their hard cocks trapped between their bellies. Lindsey rolled his hips. Aubrey whispered huskily into his ear, "Lindsey." And then Lindsey awoke with prick in hand bucking into his fist. His seed spilled over his sheets as the name "Aubrey" tumbled from his lips onto his pillow. It left his mind in a haze. Some minutes later, when the lovely languid feeling wore off, Lindsey had much to consider. Certain sonnets of Shakespeare and large portions of the classical texts he'd studied at Eton made far more sense in light of his sudden self-discovery. He understood what compelled Zeus to carry Ganymede to Olympus and cast his image among the stars, what drove Hadrian to deify Antinous. New worlds bloomed into being, all revolving around the dark son of Aubrey. An anticipatory shudder ran through Lindsey's frame. He expended a tremendous effort to harness his imagination. As much as he wished to, he could hardly gallop to the mill and pounce on its clerk. A true gentleman would ask permission first, and for all he knew, he might be refused. This possibility cast a shadow over his sunny disposition, but not for long. He'd simply have to prove himself worthy of Aubrey's affections, and he was determined to do so. Nobody bothered Aubrey when he stayed at the office past 8 o'clock. Everyone else, from mill hands to stationary engineers to his fellow office staff, left far earlier. To hear a knock on the door was most unexpected, and when he called out for the unexpected to come in, it doubly astonished him to see Mr. Althorp enter. "Good evening, sir," he managed despite his bewilderment. What a pleasant surprise. Even more surprising, Aubrey realised his idle comment was sincere. He put considerable effort into tempering his enthusiasm. It wouldn't do to let slip just how much he appreciated the visit. If Smith hadn't left hours ago, the humiliation alone would have struck Aubrey stone dead. Mr. Althorp, or Lindsey as he allowed Aubrey to call him, showed no such restraint. His winning smile made it perfectly clear how delighted he felt to be in the mill office after hours, for reasons beyond Aubrey's understanding. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything," said Lindsey. He was, of course, but Aubrey would never tell him so. "Not at all. To what do we owe the pleasure?" The moment the phrase escaped his throat, Aubrey wished he could snatch it back. It wasn't a pleasure for a mill owner to drop in on his employees without warning. He ought to have asked what he could do for Lindsey. That would have demonstrated a work ethic beyond sycophantic flattery. But Lindsey didn't seem to notice the subtle difference. "Is Mr. Jennings available?" he asked. The question caused Aubrey unaccountable disappointment. He refused to reflect on why this might be. "No, sir. I'm afraid Mr. Jennings went home some time past." "And the other clerk?" Lindsey asked before Aubrey could offer his services as a replacement. "Mr. Smith, wasn't it? Is he in?" Smith had gone home for lunch and never returned, though Lindsey didn't need to know that. Neither did he need to know how the thought of Smith as an acceptable substitute, preferable to Aubrey himself, made Aubrey queasy. Still, he replied in a level tone. "No." To his astonishment, Lindsey grinned. "Perfect," he said, and took the liberty of hanging his hat on the coat rack. "I'd hoped to make a request of you particularly, and in private." As he talked, he advanced across the room until he came to Aubrey's desk and seated himself quite casually on the corner of it. Aubrey, meanwhile, refused to accept this version of reality. Lindsey couldn't possibly mean what he supposed. Life didn't work that way. Surely Lindsey spoke in jest. Yet, as Aubrey looked into his eyes, the two blue eyes of a man who'd given him an expensive, if thoughtless, gift, along with words of praise and a request to be called by his Christian name, he found a shy, hopeful expression. "I would be delighted," said Lindsey, "if you would do me the honour of accompanying me to the theatre." Aubrey felt a slight pressure on his thigh. He glanced down to find Lindsey's hand upon it. He buried his initial reaction of wild, inappropriate glee deep down where Lindsey would never see it. Yet while he could hide his joy from the outside world, he couldn't escape it within the confines of his own mind. His imagination presented a whirlwind of vignettes. Lindsey's fingers brushing the arm of his jacket as they walked to the theatre. Once inside, Aubrey taking advantage of the darkness to rest his hand in Lindsey's lap. He and Lindsey sharing a cab home after the show. Lindsey undoing the buttons of his waistcoat. Lindsey's mouth on his throat. Lindsey straddling him. At present, Lindsey's hand remained on his thigh. Aubrey reined in his fantasies, lest Lindsey encounter more than he'd expected there. Or perhaps precisely what he'd expected. Aubrey swallowed hard. Regardless of his tempting offer, Lindsey remained Aubrey's superior. If Lindsey tired of his companionship, Aubrey would be tossed back in the gutter. The alternate possibility that Aubrey's own interest would wane, and Lindsey would demand continued affection as a condition of his employment, didn't sound any more appealing. And if by some miracle a third path appeared, as the stupider parts of Aubrey's brain hoped, wherein he and Lindsey remained inseparable in mutual bliss until the end of their days, Aubrey couldn't conceive of a world in which he became anything more than Lindsey's pet clerk, a filthy little secret. No. He'd moved on from that role long ago. He had no intention of returning to it now. Then again, considering all he'd accepted from Lindsey, it looked as if he'd returned to it already. Realising this uncomfortable truth left Aubrey with only one respectable option. He took a deep breath, gathering courage along with air, and spoke. "Mr. Althorp, I am not entirely comfortable with the position of your hand."
That was the 5th chapter of my gay Victorian romance, Mr. Warren's Profession, narrated by Gary Furlong. We'll be back next week with more Right Here, Right Queer, and as always, thank you for listening.